On the morning of August 13th, 2018, a man stood on his front lawn in Frederick, Colorado, and told a local news camera that he just wanted his family back. He looked directly into the lens. His voice barely wavered. He said he wanted his pregnant wife to come home. He said he wanted his 2 little girls to come home. He said the house was empty without them, and he did not know where they were. He was lying. He knew exactly where they were, because he had put them there. What happened inside that house on Saratoga Trail in the days before that interview, and what investigators uncovered in the 72 hours that followed it, became one of the most watched, most shared, and most deeply disturbing true crime cases of the modern era. Not because it was mysterious, not because it was unsolved, but because of how ordinary it all looked from the outside. A nice house in a nice neighborhood, a pretty pregnant wife, 2 little girls with gap-toothed smiles, a husband who stood on his lawn and looked into a camera and lied so smoothly that for a moment, just a moment, you almost believed him. Almost. This is the story of Chris Watts, and it is one of the most chilling cases this channel has ever covered, not because of what we don't know, but because of everything we do. Shanann Watts was 34 years old in the summer of 2018. She was originally from North Carolina, warm and outgoing, and the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like they mattered. She had built a significant following on social media, documenting her life, her family, her work as a representative for a health and wellness company called Live Well Thrive. Her feed was full of her daughters. Bella was 4 years old. Celeste was 3. They had their mother's warmth and their father's blue eyes, and they appeared in video after video, laughing and dancing, and being exactly what 4- and 3-year-olds are supposed to be. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant when she died. She and Chris had announced the pregnancy to their families just weeks earlier. They were going to name the baby Nico if it was a boy. Chris Watts was 33 years old. He was quiet where Shanann was outgoing, reserved where she was expressive. He worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, a job that required early morning shifts and gave him access to remote oil field locations in the Colorado countryside. By the summer of 2018, the Watts family was under significant financial pressure. They were behind on their mortgage. Credit card debt had accumulated. The life they presented on social media, the nice house, the new cars, the vacations, was being funded in ways that were not sustainable. And Chris Watts had a secret. Her name was Nicole Kessinger. She was a co-worker at Anadarko. The affair had begun in June of 2018, approximately 6 weeks before Shanann and the girls were killed. What investigators later pieced together from phone records, text messages, and Nicole Kessinger's own interviews with police painted a picture of a man who had made a decision and was moving toward it with a coldness that is difficult to comprehend. Chris and Nicole had been in constant contact throughout the weeks of the affair. Hundreds of texts, long phone calls. He had told her things about his marriage that were designed to make the relationship seem more available than it was. He had told her the marriage was effectively over, that he and Shanann were separating. What he had not told Nicole Kessinger, and what she has maintained she did not know, was what he was planning. Shanann had been away with her daughters visiting friends in Arizona for the 5 weeks prior to August 12th. She and Chris had been communicating during that time, working through what were clearly significant marital problems. Text messages recovered by investigators showed the tension between them. Shanann knew something was wrong with her husband. She did not know what. She flew home in the early hours of August 13th, arriving at the house on Saratoga Trail at approximately 1:48 in the morning. She never left that house again. What happened inside the Watts home in the hours after Shanann returned from Arizona has been established through physical evidence, confession, and the kind of forensic detail that leaves very little room for ambiguity. Chris Watts strangled his wife in their bedroom while their daughters slept down the hall. Then he went to his daughters. Bella and Celeste Watts were 4 and 3 years old. They were asleep in their beds. Their father walked into their rooms. I am not going to describe in detail what happened next, because some things deserve a boundary, and this is one of them. What I will tell you is that both girls were killed that night, and that what Chris Watts did with their bodies afterward is something that prosecutors described in court as an act of almost incomprehensible callousness. He loaded his family into his company truck in the early morning darkness. He drove to a remote Anadarko oil field site called Cervi 319, approximately 40 miles from the house. He knew the location. He had worked there. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave at the site. He put his daughters in oil storage tanks. Bella and Celeste Watts, 4 and 3 years old, were placed inside industrial oil storage tanks at a remote Colorado oil field by their father. And then Chris Watts drove back to Frederick, Colorado, and went about his day. Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson had arranged to meet her that morning for a previously scheduled work meeting. When Shanann did not answer her door, did not respond to texts, and did not pick up her phone, Nicole became concerned. This was not like Shanann. She called Chris. Chris Watts told her that Shanann had not been home when he left for work that morning. He seemed unconcerned. Nicole called the police. Officers arrived at the house on Saratoga Trail. Chris Watts met them outside. He was cooperative. He invited them in. He answered their questions. He told them Shanann's car was still in the garage and her purse and phone were still in the house, which was unusual, but that he assumed she had left with a friend. The officers noted that he seemed calm, measured. Not the way a man acts when his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters are missing. A neighbor had a video doorbell camera. Footage from that camera showed Chris Watts loading items into his truck in the early morning darkness before he had claimed to leave for work. The items were large, the movements were deliberate. He made multiple trips. The investigation shifted gear immediately. The local news interview happened that same day, August 13th. Chris Watts stood on his front lawn and spoke to a reporter from Denver's KMGH television station. That interview has been watched millions of times. Body language experts, criminal psychologists, and ordinary viewers have analyzed it frame by frame. What most people notice immediately is what is not there. There are no tears, there is no visible distress. He speaks about his missing pregnant wife and daughters with a flatness, a smoothness that sits wrong. When he mentions Shanann, he refers to her physical characteristics in a way that feels detached. When he talks about wanting his family back, he does not look like a man who is breaking apart. He looks like a man performing the idea of a man who is breaking apart, and not performing it particularly well. The FBI became involved within hours. Chris Watts was brought in for a formal interview. And what happened in that interview room is one of the most remarkable pieces of footage in modern true crime history. The FBI used a technique called the cognitive interview combined with behavioral analysis. They were calm, they were methodical, they let Chris Watts talk. And he talked. He told investigators that he had confronted Shanann that morning about the state of their marriage. He said he told her he wanted to separate. He claimed that while he was having this conversation with Shanann, he looked at a baby monitor and watched through the camera as his daughters were killed by their mother in their beds. He sat in that interview room and told federal investigators that Shanann Watts had killed Bella and Celeste. It was the kind of claim that, if true, would explain everything. A grieving husband, a disturbed wife, a tragedy rather than a murder. It was not true. The physical evidence dismantled his story completely. The forensic analysis of the girl's cause of death was inconsistent with Shanann having committed it. The timeline established by the neighbor's doorbell camera was inconsistent with his account. The items loaded into his truck before dawn were inconsistent with his account. Everything was inconsistent with his account. On August 15th, 2 days after Shanann was reported missing, and 1 day after the FBI interview, law enforcement directed Chris Watts to the Cervi 319 oil field site. They found Shanann's body in the shallow grave. They found Bella and Celeste in the oil tanks. Chris Watts was arrested in his front yard. The case against Chris Watts was overwhelming. The physical evidence, the cell phone data, the surveillance footage, the forensic analysis, the affair, the financial pressure, the lies. There was no plausible defense. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison. During the sentencing hearing, members of Shanann's family spoke. Her father said things that no parent should ever have to say in a courtroom. Her brother said that Chris Watts had not just taken Shanann and the girls. He had taken the future. Every birthday that would never happen. every Christmas morning, every first day of school, every ordinary Tuesday that a family takes for granted until it is gone. Nico, the baby who was 15 weeks from being born, never got a name on a birth certificate. The name his parents had chosen was added to the memorial: Nico Watts, a child who existed and was loved and was taken before the world ever got to know him. After his conviction, Chris Watts gave a series of jailhouse interviews that investigators and true crime researchers have analyzed extensively. He changed his story multiple times. He gave different accounts of the sequence of events. He described his state of mind in ways that shifted between interviews. He cried in some of them. Whether those tears were genuine remorse or a performance of remorse is a question that people who study this case continue to debate. What has never changed is the physical reality of what he did. In 2019, the Watts family discovery documents were released publicly by the Weld County District Attorney's Office. Thousands of pages of investigative files, interview transcripts, text messages, and forensic reports. The release was unusual in its scope and created a second wave of public attention and analysis that brought millions of new people to the case. Those documents painted a picture of a marriage under enormous strain, of a man who had constructed a fantasy about a future with another woman and had decided, in the most cold and irreversible way possible, to clear the path toward it. He did not consider leaving. He did not consider divorce. He did not consider any of the options that ordinary people in difficult marriages consider every single day. He considered one option and he took it. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She loved her daughters with everything she had. She had built a life and a community and a following of people who felt connected to her through the warmth she put out into the world every day. Bella Watts was 4 years old. She loved unicorns and dinosaurs and her little sister. Celeste Watts was 3 years old. She called herself Cece. Nico Watts was 15 weeks old and had a name his parents had chosen together before one of them decided none of them would live to use it. They are buried together in North Carolina, near Shanann's family, far from the state where they were killed. Their graves are visited by strangers who leave flowers and toys and handwritten notes, the same impulse that drove strangers to leave flowers at the grave of the boy in the box, the same refusal to let the victims of terrible things be forgotten just because the people who loved them most are no longer there to remember them publicly. That impulse matters. It has always mattered. It's one of the most human things we do. Chris Watts is currently incarcerated at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. He will never be released. This case is solved. The perpetrator is behind bars. There's no mystery here in the traditional sense. But the reason this case has never left the public consciousness, the reason it continues to be watched and discussed and returned to years after a guilty plea closed it legally, is because of the question underneath the question. Not who did it. We know who did it. But how? How does a man who stood at an altar and made promises, who was present in that delivery room twice, who held those girls when they were born, who had Bella's small handprints framed on the wall of his house, how does that man do what Chris Watts did? That question does not have a clean answer. It may not have any answer that fully satisfies. And that is why we keep coming back to it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. This case draws some of the most powerful responses of anything we cover on this channel, and I want to hear from you. If you are new here, subscribe to the Unsolved Vault and hit the bell so you never miss a case. And if you have a case you think this community needs to hear, drop it below. We will be back very soon.